One of the things you may notice if you're reading through John's Gospel, and even if you're not, I'm going to tell you, is that John's Gospel is different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the synoptic Gospels. That comes from a Greek term that means to see as like through a common lens. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke have much more in common as far as how they look at Jesus than John's Gospel. For example, we read in Mark's Gospel, which is the oldest, and even in Matthew and Luke, of Jesus casting demons out of people. We don't hear about that at all in John's Gospels. In Matthew and Luke and in Mark, Jesus teaches in parables. There are almost no parables whatsoever in John's Gospel. When you look at how Jesus teaches, it's often in short, pithy phrases in the synoptic Gospels. In John, Jesus tends to speak in longer discourses, much more like a philosophy professor, if you will. It's like longer speeches, like we see in the Bread of Life discourse in chapter 6. And we also see Jesus having these long encounters with individuals that sometimes fill almost a chapter, like with the Samaritan woman in chapter 4, and then in John chapter 9, where we have Jesus encountering this man who was born blind. It's a remarkable story, and I hope you look at it closely. Our verse of the day is John chapter 9, verse 5, where Jesus says, "As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." And that's an image he had used in the previous chapter in John chapter 8 and verse 12. And in this story of the man born blind, which again, I've preached about, I can give you 30 minutes on it, but I don't have 30 minutes. Part of what I want you to note about this story are two things. One, the disciples ask, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? I mean, come on. I mean, can you imagine having a theology that thinks God would punish parents by giving them a blind child because the parents sinned? And yet that was part of what people thought back then. But the second thing, and Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. And he then goes on to say how the fact that this man is blind can be used to glorify God. And Jesus tells him to go and wash, and he comes back and he's able to see. And that's where the trouble starts for the man. And I encourage you to read the story for yourself. But one of the key things we learn from this encounter is just because you come to faith in Christ, just because you accept Jesus, doesn't mean your life is going to get easy. In fact, often when Jesus comes into someone's life, things may get harder before they get easier. And that's certainly the case for the man born blind. He comes back able to see, and now the authorities in his synagogue start to critique him and interrogate him. His parents are so intimidated they don't want to defend him and say he can speak for himself. And what you see is the man's understanding of Jesus leveling up. Look in John chapter 9 for how the man describes Jesus. He goes from describing him as a man to a prophet to even more. And at the end of the story, Jesus encounters him and he says to Jesus, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. And that's the goal of Jesus, the light of the world, that people who were blind could see, and those who were spiritually blind can be enlightened and see Jesus for who he truly is.